Bonjour, bon mardi à tous. Je suis Boris Proulx, journaliste parlementaire au journal Le Devoir, et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse de Karen Hogan, la vérificatrice générale du Canada, sur les rapports déposés ce matin. I'm Boris Proulx, reporter for Le Devoir, and welcome to this press conference with Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada, regarding the report tabled this morning. We will have a few remarks from the Auditor General, and then we will go for a question period. So if you are listening on Zoom, please use the raise hand function during the press conference, and we'll come to you after the questions in the room. Donc, si vous êtes sur Zoom, utilisez la fonction « Lever la main » à tout moment durant la conférence de presse, et nous allons vous donner la parole après les quelques questions dans la salle. So on that, here to you, here's to you, Auditor General.
Merci. Bonjour et merci de vous joindre à moi. J'aimerais d'abord souligner que nous nous trouvons sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous parler des résultats de nos deux plus récents audits relatifs à la COVID-19. Ce dépôt porte à 11 le nombre de rapports liés à la COVID-19 que nous avons livrés depuis le début de la pandémie au Canada, il y a maintenant plus de 2 ans. The 9 COVID-19 audits we delivered in 2021 looked at the government's actions to respond to the pandemic and at whether federal organizations were prepared to deal with a large-scale public health emergency. With the audits we are releasing today, the focus of our work is shifting to look at how federal departments and organizations managed programs and services for Canadians as the pandemic continued to evolve. Our first audit examined how the federal government procured and distributed vaccines to the provinces and territories to immunize Canadians against COVID-19. In Canada, public health is a shared responsibility between the federal government, the provinces, and the territories. Dans l'ensemble, nous avons constaté que l'Agence de la santé publique du Canada et Santé Canada, avec le soutien de Services publics et approvisionnement Canada, avaient travaillé ensemble pour répondre à l'urgence de la pandémie. Ils ont obtenu des vaccins contre la COVID-19 pour pouvoir immuniser plus rapidement possible l'ensemble de la population canadienne. En 2020, Services publics et approvisionnement Canada a conclu des ententes d'achat anticipés avec 7 sociétés qui avaient le potentiel de produire des vaccins viables. En concluant ces ententes, le gouvernement augmentait ses chances d'obtenir assez de doses pour fournir le plus vaste programme d'immunisation de l'histoire du pays, tout en reconnaissant que cette approche pourrait entraîner un surplus de doses si tous les vaccins étaient un jour approuvés. Santé Canada a ajusté son processus d'autorisation habituel pour accélérer l'approbation réglementaire des vaccins contre la COVID-19. Entre décembre 2020 et mai 2022, le gouvernement fédéral s'est procuré 169 millions de doses de vaccins. Plus de 84 millions d'entre elles ont été administrées par les provinces et les territoires à des personnes admissibles partout au Canada. En moyenne, l'Agence de la santé publique a livré les vaccins 2 jours après qu'une province ou un territoire les ait demandés. Cette livraison était rapide, étant donné les exigences logistiques qui entrent en jeu lorsqu'il s'agit de livrer à des endroits parfois éloignés des matières sensibles aux variations de température. While the organizations involved were successful in securing vaccines and quickly distributing them to the provinces and territories, the Public Health Agency of Canada's efforts to minimize wastage were unsuccessful. By the end of May 2022, Canada had 32.5 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines, estimated to be worth about $1 billion in federal, provincial, and territorial inventories. Another 50.6 million doses were deemed surplus and offered for donation. we found that the agency's ability to reduce wastage was affected by delays in implementing important functionalities of Vaccine Connect, the information technology system meant to help manage COVID-19 vaccines. We also found that the Public Health Agency did not have finalized data sharing agreements with the provinces and territories. As a result, it struggled to effectively share detailed case-level safety surveillance data with Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and vaccine companies. Nous avons soulevé les problèmes d'échange de données sur la santé entre les autorités de santé fédérales, provinciales et territoriales en 1999, en 2002, en 2008 et plus récemment en 2021 dans notre audit de la préparation en cas de pandémie. Il est urgent de remédier à ces problèmes de longue date, notamment en mettant en œuvre un cadre pan-canadien d'échange d'informations, car l'échange de données sur la santé est au cœur d'une surveillance efficace pour assurer la sécurité de la population canadienne. Je vais passer maintenant au second audit que nous avons publié aujourd'hui. Il porte sur plusieurs programmes de soutien pour les personnes face à la COVID-19 et aussi sur la subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada qui offrait un soutien aux employeurs. Tous ces programmes sont des mesures que le gouvernement a mises en place pour atténuer l'incidence de la pandémie de COVID-19 sur la santé de la population canadienne, des entreprises et de l'économie du pays. Overall, we found that the Canada Revenue Agency and Employment and Social Development Canada effectively delivered COVID-19 programs to provide quick financial relief to individuals and employers affected by the pandemic. In this way, they served to prevent an increase in poverty and income inequalities and helped the economy bounce back. In 2020, the government decided to rely on information provided by applicants and limit prepayment controls to expedite helping people and employers affected by the pandemic. In doing so, it recognized that there was a risk that some payments would go to ineligible recipients. We found that overpayments of $4.6 billion were made to ineligible individuals, and we estimated that at least $27.4 billion of payments to individuals and employers should be investigated further. The Canada Revenue Agency and Employment and Social Development Canada recognized the need for increased post-payment verification work with the early decision to limit prepayment controls. As the pandemic continued to evolve, the post-payment verifications were delayed. The number of post-payment verifications included in the plans is insufficient to address all payments at risk of being ineligible. The agency and the department are not planning to verify payments made to all identified recipients who may not be eligible for COVID-19 benefit programs. Les efforts déployés jusqu'à présent en vue de recouvrer les montants exigibles ont été limités et ont surtout visé à provoquer des remboursements volontaires. En date de cet été, l'Agence du revenu du Canada avait recouvré environ 2,3 milliards de dollars. Je suis préoccupée par le manque de rigueur des activités de vérification après paiement et de recouvrement. L'Agence du revenu du Canada et Emploi et Développement social Canada doivent agir dès maintenant pour élargir leur plan de vérification après paiement afin d'y inclure tous les bénéficiaires identifiés comme à risque d'être non admissibles aux prestations. L'Agence et le ministère doivent ensuite mettre en œuvre leur plan et recouvrer les montants exigibles au titre de prestations liées à la COVID-19. The pandemic prompted the creation and delivery of income support programs never seen before in Canada. Many were up and running in a matter of weeks, where normally it would have taken months or even years. Though government organizations knew in 2020 that they would need to undertake significant post-payment work down the road, They have not adjusted their resources or plans to deal with the long-term effects of vast income support programs that were rolled out in record time. Billions of dollars have gone or may have gone to ineligible recipients. To preserve the integrity and fairness of Canada's tax system, the government is required under current legislation to take action. If it chooses a different approach, then it must be clear and transparent with Canadians. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Je suis maintenant prête à répondre à vos questions. Merci.
Thank you. Merci. If you are attending on Zoom, please use the raise hand function at this point to ask a question. Mais nous allons d'abord commencer par les questions dans la salle, en commençant par Nojoud Al-Malis de la presse canadienne, from Canadian Press.
Hi. My first question is about the report on the COVID benefits. I'm wondering if you could compare a little bit the benefits for individuals versus businesses. Which do you see were more successful in their delivery and also verification and just as a whole?
So when it came to the benefit programs, we found overall that they were quite effective in meeting the government's objectives of first getting support out to individuals and employers quickly, minimizing the increase in poverty or income inequalities, and also helping the economy bounce back from the pandemic. So that would lump in both the individual and support to employers. When I divide them up throughout the pandemic, what we saw is that the government tried to adjust and add some additional prepayment controls and made modifications to the programs linked to individuals, but really missed those opportunities when it came to the business support. What we found is that even though the program kept getting extended for the wage subsidy, there was no addition of prepayment controls, which would have minimized the need for rather lengthy and complex post-payment work related to businesses. When it comes to recovery, I think that was the last part of your question, I would say they're at such early stages in both individual and employers that it is too early to tell. That's why we recommended much more rigorous plans. That was the commitment that both of the departments made following my first audits in 2021, that they would put in place comprehensive post-payment plans, and we're just not seeing that happen right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my follow-up question is about the other report. This is on behalf of my colleague, but she's wondering if you could be a little bit more specific about, how to prevent wasted doses in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's been many recommendations following H1N1 and SARS, and even the first report I released on pandemic preparedness that talked about the need to not only resolve data sharing agreements across provinces and territories to have a more timely and informed response, but also to have the technology needed to support that. Vaccine Connect was something that was put in place during the response, the rollout of these COVID vaccines, which really, they could have had a better system in place earlier. If they had implemented all of the functionalities of Vaccine Connect, that could have helped identify supply needs and when vaccines were likely to expire and move them around more effectively, which would have minimized potential wastage.
Thank you. The next question is Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour. Vous dites que vous êtes inquiète d'un montant là, de 27 milliards de dollars en termes de prestations. C'est quand même beaucoup d'argent. Pouvez-vous m'expliquer qu'est-ce qui aurait dû être fait dans le suivi pour s'assurer que cet argent-là a été bien dépensé, ou du moins pour qu'on puisse le récupérer? Puis est-ce qu'il est trop tard pour récupérer cet argent-là? Vous évoquez 36 mois, ça laisse pas grand temps. Est-il déjà trop tard pour récupérer ces sommes-là potentiellement?
Alors, on a constaté qu'il y avait des paiements faits entre autres totalisant 4,6 milliards de dollars à des personnes qui n'étaient pas inéligibles. Le suivi débute et est en train de se faire là, par les ministères. Et nous avons aussi estimé qu'il y a environ 27,4 milliards de dollars qui devraient être investigués, où ce que les vérifications de post-paiement doivent être effectuées par le gouvernement. C'est parce que nous avons identifié des indicateurs à autre risque que les individus, les entreprises ne sont pas éligibles pour les montants qu'ils ont reçus. Ce qui me préoccupe, c'est que les plans ne sont pas exhaustifs. Les plans n'incluent pas toutes les activités et n'incluent pas un suivi pour identifier si les individus, les entreprises sont éligibles. Il faut faire cette première étape avant de décider si le recouvrement est de besoin. Le temps, c'est qu'en ce moment, dans la loi, il y a un délai pour les contribuables, les individus, d'environ 36 mois. S'il n'y a pas d'informations erronées par intention qui a été fournie, sinon le délai serait plus longtemps. Et pour les entreprises, c'est environ entre 36 et 48 mois. Et alors, c'est pour ça que je m'attendais que les activités de post-paiement débutent et nous avons recommandé qu'ils devraient être beaucoup plus exhaustives avant que le délai arrive.
Pour les vaccins, ce que vous nous offrez là, le 13 millions de doses gaspillées, ça c'était en date du 31 mai. Selon vos estimations ou vos prévisions, est-ce que vous pensez que ce chiffre-là va gonfler de manière importante? Parce que vous notez qu'il y a beaucoup de doses qui sont en réserve, qui vont arriver à péremption là, dans quelques semaines, à la fin de l'année. Donc, est-ce que ce chiffre-là va augmenter de manière importante, les doses gaspillées?
Alors, c'est exactement une question que j'ai demandée à l'Agence de santé publique Canada pour me dire qu'est-ce qui est arrivé à ces doses-là après le temps de notre DIE. Notre DIE a terminé le 31 mai 2022. Le ministère m'a confirmé qu'il y a environ un autre 11 millions de doses à ce point-ci qui ont expiré. Et alors, oui, le chiffre de doses qui ne sont pas utilisées, qui sont en stockage, pourrait continuer à augmenter, même avec l'achat de les variants au lieu des doses qui sont existantes dans l'inventaire. Donc, le problème continue. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons recommandé que Vaccine Connect devrait être mis en place pour mieux gérer les vaccins et minimiser le potentiel de gaspillage dans le futur.
Merci. Next up, Brian, National Post.
Yeah, hi there. On vaccines, I'm wondering overall, you've talked about some of the logistical issues and the tracking, et cetera, that government could have done better. But having ordered 7 different vaccines and tens of millions of doses in advance, was this level of wastage unavoidable once all these vaccines were delivered and worked as well as the government expected, I guess?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a great question now to sit here and look back and think of what happened, and I would invite all of us to try and put ourselves back in March of 2020 and the environment that was going on then when the government entered into advance purchase agreements. There was a global rush to develop a vaccine. No one knew which vaccine companies would develop viable vaccines, which would then be approved for use in Canada. There was a large global demand where Canada doesn't have any manufacturing capabilities for those vaccines. So in my view, the approach that the government took to enter into advance purchase agreements was a prudent one. They knew that that would result in excess vaccines or surplus vaccines being available, which is why there was a commitment to make donations. But there again, so many countries were trying to donate, and that market saturated, resulting in the Canadian government not being as successful as they could. But in my view, it was a prudent approach given all the uncertainty back in 2020, and now we're able to look back and see the results of those decisions.
Okay. Just a follow-up for a colleague. In terms of the overpayments of the CERB and other benefits, do you have an estimation of how much of those overpayments are the result of sort of good faith mistakes by Canadians and how much are fraud? And do you have an estimate of how much you think the government can realistically expect to recover from that process?
Unfortunately, I can't give you an answer to either of those questions because of the limited information that's available at the Canada Revenue Agency right now. When it came to individuals, The 2019 and 2020 tax returns are now available. They weren't available earlier on, which is why we've identified some payments that require further investigation that I feel pretty confident are ineligible. But in order to really give, take the more prudent approach of giving the benefit of the doubt to the taxpayer, we've identified them as needing follow-up. When it comes to the businesses, there was very little information that was collected on a monthly basis. And so without post-payment verification, it would be almost impossible to know the ability to recover or not, or even to identify with greater certainty what went to ineligible businesses, which is why much more rigorous post-payment work is needed from the government.
Thank you. Next up, Bill Curry, Globe and Mail.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. To follow up on the $27 billion, one of your recommendations is the government should more aggressively pursue that, and you describe it as a minimum amount, that it could be more than that. The government's response is that they only partially agree to that recommendation, and they make the argument that it is likely not cost efficient to go after all of that money. So what is your reaction to their response to that?
Well, I obviously stand by my recommendations, and I base my recommendations on two things. Following our 2021 audit on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the department's committed to rigorous post-payment work. And so I was expecting to see that happening now, and it is just not happening to the degree that I believe it should be, given the very limited prepayment controls that were used at the start of these programs. The second is I would point to existing legislation that requires that every Canadian taxpayer be treated fairly, and that if an individual or a business receives something they're not entitled to, it should be returned. So our expectation is that anyone who has a high indicator of potentially being ineligible should be investigated further. The decision then about recovery is one that I encourage the government to be transparent about what they decide to do. If they want to perhaps forgive payments or take a compassionate approach, then they should just be clear and transparent with all Canadians what to expect.
I think from memory, it's pretty unusual for a government to not fully accept a recommendation. I could be wrong on that, but in the back and forth, had they at any point rejected outright that recommendation? Can you kind of talk about the back and forth that went into that?
No, so I think most departments like to agree to our recommendations. I'm not sure that their written answer then supports that agreement, but that's another issue for us to deal with. Here, the back and forth that we had was very clear. They felt that they didn't have the resources or the ability to follow up with everyone identified as ineligible. But again, I base it on fairness to all taxpayers. I'm sure there are individuals out there who are wondering, will I be asked to repay? Will I be able to repay? And that's where I encourage that their plans should just be made clear to Canadians so that every individual and business knows what to expect.
On va passer à Raphaël Pirot, Agence QMI.
Oui, bonjour. Écoutez, je voulais savoir s'il y a un montant minimum dont on est sûr d'avoir perdu là-dedans. Donc, de l'argent qui est versé en trop et qu'on sait qu'on ne pourra jamais aller chercher.
Encore, c'est une question que je ne pourrais pas répondre. Je ne connais pas la capacité d'un individu ou d'une entreprise de rembourser le gouvernement s'ils ont reçu des paiements pour lesquels ils n'étaient pas inéligibles. Nous avons identifié, c'est certain, 4,6 milliards de dollars qui ont été payés à des individus qui ne sont pas inéligibles, qui sont inéligibles, je m'excuse. Le 27,4 milliards de dollars est vraiment un minimum parce qu'il y a d'autres critères d'éligibilité qu'on ne pouvait pas vérifier. Et c'est pour cela que le gouvernement peut juste identifier ces montants s'ils font leur vérification de post-paiement rigoureuse pour être en mesure de bien cibler les montants. D'accord. Et deuxième question, en fait, il y a une grande différence entre le 5 milliards et le 27 milliards. Comment est-ce qu'on explique ça? Alors, le 4,6 milliards de dollars, c'est des paiements qui ont été fournis, la plupart, c'est des paiements qui ont été fournis à des individus au début de la pandémie en double. Alors, tous les programmes de prestations pour les individus, une personne peut juste recevoir une prestation durant une période. Et au début, un peu de confusion. Les individus faisaient une demande à Emploi et Développement social Canada et aussi à l'Agence de revenus du Canada. Alors, ils ont reçu des paiements en double et c'est ceux-là, avec certaineté, qui devraient faire un suivi dessus. Les autres, c'est un peu des estimés ou de l'information qui est manquante à l'Agence de revenus du Canada. Et c'est pour cela que c'est juste plus gros. C'est le restant de tous les autres programmes.
We'll go to Mackenzie Gray, Global.
You've said that the programs or the money programs were effective in meeting the government's objectives. But considering the amount of money that's kind of unaccounted for here in terms of whether or not it was appropriately paid out, do you think the programs themselves were effective?
So we concluded they were effective in meeting the objectives, which I would summarize high level as getting funds out quickly to individuals and businesses, minimizing an increase in poverty or income inequalities across the country, and also allowing businesses to maintain that relationship with their employees and rebound once the economy reopened. That was effective. There's lots of statistics in our report from Statistics Canada that demonstrate them. I would argue that they were inefficient in that the decision early on to limit pre-payment controls, knowing that there would be payments made to ineligible individuals, has now resulted in billions of dollars going to ineligible individuals or potentially going to ineligible individuals. And that's why the hard work is now needed when you minimize prepayment to do rigorous post-payment work to identify who is really ineligible and then make decisions about recovery.
Just in English, similar to my colleague's question, it is a big gap between 4.7 and 27. Why is there such a wide gap there from your perspective?
So the $4.6 billion that we identified that was to ineligible individuals really relates to the start of the pandemic, where mostly I would assume because of confusion, individuals applied to both the Canada Revenue Agency and Employment and Social Development Canada to receive the same benefit for one period. So all of the individual income support programs, and individuals only allowed to receive one benefit per period. So that doubling up is the $4.6 billion for the most part. The rest, we're talking about all the other COVID programs as they continue to go on versus just the first few months of the pandemic. So that explains the large difference in the two buckets of funds that we identified.
Dernière question dans la salle, Antoine Trépanier, Le Droit.
Vous parlez d'un manque de rigueur dans le recouvrement. Est-ce que vous avez été en mesure d'identifier la cause de ce manque de rigueur-là? Est-ce qu'on parle de directives politiques, de structures, de gouvernance ou de systèmes qui sont en place? Est-ce que c'est la main-d'œuvre qui a mal fait son travail? Est-ce que c'est les fonctionnaires qui ont mal fait leur travail? Est-ce que vous avez pu identifier la cause de ce manque de rigueur-là?
Alors, je pense que la première, c'est que les plans ne sont pas exhaustifs. Les plans n'incluent pas toutes les activités qui sont prévues et non plus n'incluent pas des activités pour déterminer si tous les paiements qui ont un indicateur de risque d'inéligibilité vont faire un suivi. C'est là le manque de rigueur. Le délai de ces travaux, nous avons demandé cette question-là à l'Agence du revenu du Canada. Ils nous ont confirmé que le délai, à cause de la pandémie, continuait et qu'ils attendaient. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons recommandé qu'ils doivent vraiment effectuer plus de travaux bientôt à cause du délai dans la loi d'identifier si les paiements sont faits à des individus et des entreprises qui sont inéligibles.
Ces deux ministères-là qui sont mentionnés dans votre rapport, c'est là où il y a eu beaucoup de mouvements de personnel, de nouveaux fonctionnaires, des embauches. Est-ce que ça peut avoir joué un rôle dans cette dynamique-là puis dans ces résultats-là?
Nous n'avons vraiment pas regardé les individus et les ressources au ministère. À mon avis, avoir un plan qui est compréhensif aiderait les deux entités à identifier exactement les besoins de ressources et le temps. Et c'est une autre raison pourquoi avoir un plan qui est vraiment compréhensif, mais on n'a pas regardé l'aspect de fonctionnaire et la capacité.
Merci. On va maintenant passer aux questions sur Zoom. We'll now go to the questions on Zoom. We have quite some time, so that's good. We're on course to answer them all. First up, Émilie Bergeron de La Presse canadienne.
Oui, bonjour. Pour continuer dans la même veine que mon collègue Antoine Trépanier, sur le manque de rigueur, qu'est-ce qui aurait été une approche en amont qui aurait eu plus de rigueur là, selon l'étendue de votre analyse? Qu'est-ce qui aurait été une façon de faire qui, dès le départ, là, aurait eu plus de rigueur?
Alors, dès le départ, je suis encore de l'avis que la décision prise au début de la pandémie de suivre une des meilleures pratiques internationales, de minimiser les contrôles préalables au paiement dans le temps d'une urgence, est encore une bonne décision. Mais cela vient avec le besoin d'avoir beaucoup de rigueur post-paiement. J'aurais aimé voir que le gouvernement serait ajusté pendant que la pandémie continue. Il y a eu beaucoup d'opportunités manquées quand, par exemple, la subvention salariale a été étendue à plusieurs reprises ou, suite à notre vérification en 2021, de mettre en place plus de rigueur préalable au paiement. Avec moins de rigueur là, il faut vraiment avoir un plan plus exhaustif. Et je m'attendais que le ministère utilise l'information qui était dans leurs mains, liée aux déclarations de TPS et toutes les autres informations que l'Agence de revenus avait dans leur possession pour identifier des paiements à risque d'être inéligibles. En ce moment, leurs vérifications planifiées sont très minimes. Presque semblables au taux de vérification qu'ils font dans un programme habituel où il y a beaucoup de contrôles préalables au paiement. Et je m'attendais vraiment à avoir beaucoup plus de rigueur post-paiement cette fois-ci.
En suivi, sur l'autre audit, celui sur les doses de vaccins qui ont été perdues, vous avez parlé de problèmes liés au système d'échange de données entre le fédéral et les provinces. Vous dites que c'est un problème qui n'est pas nouveau, que ça fait depuis 1999 que c'est un problème, que c'est urgent d'y remédier. Alors, est-ce que ça bloque vraiment du côté de l'Agence de la santé publique du Canada pour rétablir ce système de partage de données? Et si ça bloque de ce côté-là, là, du côté du fédéral, où exactement dans le processus ça bloque?
Alors, je ne pourrais pas vous dire si c'est vraiment le gouvernement fédéral ou tous les autres niveaux de gouvernement. Comme vous le savez, la santé est vraiment une responsabilité partagée entre tous les niveaux des gouvernements. Le manque d'une entente pan-canadien pour partager de l'information est vraiment quelque chose que ça fait plusieurs années, presque 25 années, que nous autres, comme bureau, l'avons identifié comme un problème. Et je me questionne combien d'autres d'urgences sanitaires qu'il faut qu'on passe à travers comme pays avant qu'on puisse trouver une solution à ce partage-là qui améliorerait non seulement tout notre système de santé ici au Canada, mais aussi les vies des Canadiens. Et alors, c'est pour ça que j'ai fait une recommandation pour encourager le gouvernement d'aller de l'avant pour conclure l'entente pan-canadien de partage d'informations.
Merci. Question suivante, Mylène Crête de La Presse.
Bonjour. Justement, concernant le partage de données avec les provinces, je me demandais, est-ce que vous savez comment ça se passait avec le Québec?
Non, pas du tout. Comme je ne peux pas vérifier ce qui se passe avec toutes les provinces. Vraiment, je vérifie du côté du gouvernement fédéral et ils n'ont pas cette entente-là et c'est pour ça que j'ai fait une recommandation au gouvernement fédéral d'aller de l'avant avec leurs travaux sur ce sujet.
OK, donc vous constatez qu'il n'y a pas d'entente, mais on ne sait pas après comment ça fonctionne dans les négociations avec les provinces. Ma deuxième question, c'est concernant l'Agence de revenus du Canada. Elle a annoncé la semaine dernière qu'elle voulait recouvrer 3,2 milliards de dollars de prestations versées en trop. Est-ce que, à l'aube de l'année 2023, il est trop tard, vu le délai de 36 mois, pour récupérer ces sommes-là?
À mon avis, il reste encore du temps pour identifier les paiements qui sont faits à des individus ou des entreprises qui sont inéligibles. Et après, la question de recouvrement est une que le gouvernement peut faire une fois qu'ils ont identifié les individus et les entreprises. Mais il reste un peu de temps parce que tous les paiements n'ont pas été émis au début de 2020 et je leur encourage vraiment de débuter ce travail d'une façon plus rigoureuse.
Juste, est-ce que vous savez combien de temps il resterait?
Pas avec certitude. Je pourrais vous dire que les premiers paiements ont été versés au début de 2020, vers avril 2020, et alors 36 mois approchent très vite.
Next up, JP Tasker,
Merci.
CBC. Can you hear us,
Hello.
JP?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
You can? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so you said in your conclusion that you're expecting significant unrecoverable amounts are likely to materialize with respect to the benefits that were paid out. Why have you come to this conclusion? Why aren't you confident that the government will claw back all the money that was paid out to ineligible people?
So I think I ended my closing remarks with there's a possibility that that be the case. The government needs to first, according to the current legislation, identify and notify individuals, and there is a legislative limit to that time frame in order to be able to notify individuals and businesses if they have received amounts that are ineligible. My advice to them is if they wanted to make a decision then about recovery, one that might either forgive payment or be empathetic, then that's something they should be clear and transparent to with Canadians. But current legislation would require them to follow up with those individuals and recover those amounts.
And you mentioned in the report that there's actually relatively few cases have been referred to the authorities, to the police, for fraud or identity theft. Do you think, is it fair to say that there was likely a lot more criminality around these programs that has just gone undetected?
Unfortunately, I could not confirm that. Again, a lot of information not being collected at the beginning of the program it leads to the need for post-payment work to confirm eligibility factors. When we did see instances where there was potential fraud, we ensured that the agency had either taken proper action or referred them to the authorities and didn't do any further work in order not to get in the way of that investigation.
We will go to Alex Bellingal, Toronto Star.
Hey, thank you very much. I just wanted to circle back on something you mentioned in French. I think it was to Louis' question earlier about vaccine wastage since the end of May. I guess from the inventory of 32.5 million that was sitting in various government inventories. Was I correct in hearing that you said another 11 million have since expired? And if so, do you have an idea of what the size of that inventory is now as we're a few weeks away from the end of the year?
So this is where I should have put my glasses on when I answered the first question, to be accurate with you. Those were donated. I think the question there was about donations originally, so an extra 11 million had been donated after year end, so my apologies if I did misspeak. Expired afterwards, not after year end, after the end of our audit, which was May. There was an additional, I would say about 10 million or so doses that have expired since. And this is exactly why we recommended that Vaccine Connects needs to be put into place and its full functionalities be used. We even pointed to some of the data really not being very solid data and having errors in it. As the country continues to buy doses, whether they be bivalent doses or others, it makes sense to have a better handle on where the inventory is and better management controls to avoid minimizing wastage in the future. But there is some doses, both included in inventory and those available for donation, that have since expired since the end of May.
Okay, thanks. It was probably my French, maybe not your mistake, although the transcript will tell, I guess. But an additional 10 million basically expired. So we're talking about, 23.6 million doses expired. I guess in terms of the donations, I know the report kind of touches on this. I'm wondering if you can expand on this. What did you learn about the difficulties the government has had in actually, with these surplus doses that are sitting there, donating them to other countries that need them?
Well, the Canadian government, like many governments, made a commitment to donate certain doses to foreign countries. There were some logistical complications in trying to do that. The age, the shelf life remaining on some of the vaccines at times caused some difficulties, but really the biggest was the saturation of the donation market. So many other countries were donating that Canada just couldn't ship all the ones they intended to ship.
Thank you. Next up, Chris Nardi, National Post.
Good morning. I'm just wondering, as you know, CRA has been doing audits and verifications for the better part of many decades now, and arguably has a lot of experience in that. So I'm wondering if you were surprised when you were going through their process and their post-verification protocols, surprised by how disappointed ultimately I read that you are in how, lackluster or not very thorough that they are. Was that surprising to you, considering the agency's experience?
Well, I think that the pandemic is really an unusual time, and the responses require unusual level of work. So what we found was that Canada Revenue Agency was taking its typical approach of a risk-based and sampling, and in our view, that is just not rigorous enough when you have such limited prepayment controls. And I think this is why two of our recommendations are really key in the audit about the government advancing its plans and projects to have real-time revenue and real-time payroll information systems available going forward. Not only would this just improve the integrity of Canada's tax system and have better information on hand, it would improve the efficiency and effectiveness of any future income programs that might be needed should the country have to go through a similar health emergency in the future.
And just to circle back as well to Bill Curry's questions on the kind of semi-agreed upon recommendation, CRA says basically it wouldn't be particularly efficient to try to go and recoup every single dollar that was overpaid, whereas you say, well, you should at least make, a strong effort to get as much as you can. Do you get the sense that the agency is just trying to kind of set the bar relatively low so that it can't disappoint, as opposed to actually make the maximal effort and get the maximal recovering?
Unfortunately, I can't tell you really what the agency is thinking when they decided to partially agree with my recommendation. I'd encourage you to ask them. My job is to hold them responsible for delivering programs within the current legislation and within what I believe are the best practices. When you have limited prepayment controls, you have rigorous, comprehensive post-payment work that is needed to verify eligibility.
Last question that I see on Zoom. So if you are listening on Zoom and want to ask a question, it's time to use the raise hand function at this moment. So last question is Palak Mangat from Politics Today.
Hi, Ms. Hogan. Thanks for taking our questions. In sort of the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk around the cost of individual vaccines, and the government often said that, it couldn't specifically say because of commercially sensitive info. And that it could hinder their ongoing or future negotiations with other manufacturers. Can you speak to whether or not that's something you came across too? I know that the average cost for vaccines in your report is listed at about $30, but that's as of May this year. So I'm just wondering whether or not there were other estimates that you had, or do you think those numbers maybe fluctuated dramatically?
So throughout our audit, we actually had access to all of the advance purchase agreements and amendments to them, but we too have to respect the confidentiality clauses that were included in those contracts and can't provide a lot of details about the vaccines and the vaccine costs. But I knew that Canadians and parliamentarians would want to have an idea of the estimate of the cost of a vaccine. And so what we did was use information that was publicly available, so all of the payments to vaccine companies through the public accounts of Canada, and then the 169 million doses that we saw the government had paid for during our audit period. So I can tell you that I'm confident it approximates the average cost of all the doses that the government has paid for, but I would caution that that's at a point in time. As more doses are received, that number can fluctuate up and down. Foreign exchange will play a factor. So it really is just to give sort of a benchmark to individuals on the average cost of a vaccine as of May of 2022.
Thank you.
Okay, and just,
Excuse me, go ahead for your other question, Parag.
yeah, sorry, just as a follow-up, and I don't want to be sort of alarmist here, just I guess moving forward for future emergencies or in case of the future pandemics, does the nature of these negotiations or maybe the lack of some information make it difficult for you or governments to kind of hammer out which companies are, the best or maybe most cost-effective ones? Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's unusual to have such confidentiality clauses in the pharmaceutical industry, but these were really unusual times, and what was going on in 2020 is something that really had never been seen, the global demand, the global race to find a vaccine, and so all of those played into the factors that ended up being terms and conditions of these contracts. But I was not hindered. My office had full access to all the information.
Merci. Il y a plus tout le monde a eu l'occasion de poser une question, but I'll suggest that we make a little short one of questions since we have some time left. If it's okay with you, Madame Vérificatrice Générale.
C'est vous qui contrôlez l'heure, oui.
I'll start with just a question from myself. Concernant les Boris Proulx du Devoir, concernant vos calculs du 27 milliards de dollars, c'est donc suspecté d'être inadmissible. C'est pas clair du tout parce que dans vos calculs, en page 23, je crois, de votre rapport, vous détaillez pourquoi les montants sont inadmissibles. Donc, est-ce que, selon vous, on peut carrément parler de 8,3 milliards de dollars versés à 627 000 bénéficiaires inadmissibles, 3,8 milliards versés à 1,4 million de bénéficiaires inadmissibles, 15,5 milliards à des entreprises inadmissibles. Pourquoi vous faites cette distinction-là? Pouvez-vous m'expliquer un peu?
Parce qu'on a détaillé le calcul un peu pour démontrer que c'est un peu complexe et qu'il y a un manque d'informations dans l'Agence de revenus du Canada pour qu'on puisse conclure avec certaineté que c'est des montants qui ne sont pas admissibles. Quand ça vient aux individus, c'est parce que un individu serait éligible si dans les 12 mois avant la demande du paiement, qu'ils auraient reçu au moins 5 000 $ de revenus. Mais les déclarations de revenus sont sur le calendrier annuel. Et alors, ça ne veut pas dire que c'est nécessairement le 12 mois. Et l'information par mois, salaire par mois, n'est pas disponible. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons recommandé qu'avoir un système de paie avec l'information réelle serait très utile pour le futur. Quand ça vient aux entreprises, comme j'ai mentionné auparavant, il y a aussi un manque. Il n'y a pas eu d'information qui a été ramassée par l'Agence de revenus du Canada sur les revenus par mois des entreprises et cette information-là n'existe pas à l'Agence de revenus du Canada, sauf les déclarations pour les taxes de vente. Puis encore, c'est seulement les entreprises qui fournissent ces déclarations d'une façon mensuelle. Alors, vraiment, un manque d'informations nous laisse conclure que c'est des indicateurs à autre risque que le gouvernement doit faire un suivi beaucoup plus accru.
Parce que dans la réponse du gouvernement, il dit que les indicateurs à haut risque ont été vérifiés. Mais vous, ce que vous nous dites, c'est qu'il y a d'autres indicateurs à haut risque qui ont été écartés en parlant de TPS, en parlant de tout ça.
Absolument, parce que nous autres, on a regardé vraiment la population en total des entreprises qui fournissent leur déclaration de taxes de vente provinciale par mois. On n'a pas regardé un échantillon. À mon avis, l'échantillon du gouvernement est trop petit pour être en mesure de conclure. Et c'est pour ça qu'on recommande une approche beaucoup plus compréhensive pour les vérifications de post-paiement.
So I'll go in the room for a few extra questions. I saw little fingers. I'll start with Bill, perhaps, from Global Mail.
Just want to follow up. You made a comment saying if the government wanted to waive payment obligations for reasons of empathy, they should say so. if the government went down that road, because presumably when you look at your report, a lot of the people who receive these benefits are some of the lowest income people in Canada. Some are ineligible because they didn't even have $5,000 in income, the threshold, according to your report. So if they were to make that argument, what would your take be on that?
I'm not the one who sets law or makes those kind of policy decisions, but I absolutely think it would be a reasonable approach. But I encourage them to be clear with Canadians. Right? I think one of the greatest things about our country is you can expect fairness and transparency, and I'm just asking the government to be clear with its decisions and its approaches to Canadians. Right now, the legislation would require them to follow up with every individual and business that is ineligible.
Follow up on the wage subsidy. The report breaks down by size of company, and there's a pretty sizable percentage as 5 employees or less. Are you trying to signal anything by breaking that down? Were you more concerned about particularly small companies, or is any section more high risk, I guess, of?
No, not at all. I think what we were trying to demonstrate, there's a lot of demographics in the back end of our audit report, was to show that individuals and businesses that needed support the most received it. Now it's about identifying if there are those that were ineligible for the benefits and making a decision about recovery. So it was really just to help everyone understand where the funding went, whether it was across provinces or across sizes of businesses.
Louis, en français, and then Ryan.
Bonjour, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Quand vous voyez ça, là, des dizaines de milliards de dollars dépensés, peu de suivi ensuite pour des remboursements, question très simple, est-ce que c'est de la saine gestion de finances publiques, ça, pour vous? Est-ce que c'est digne d'un pays du G7?
C'est une question qui est intéressante, mais c'est dans un temps régulier, je vous dirais que non. Mais c'est vraiment un temps qui n'est pas régulier. L'approche qui a été prise au début de la pandémie était une approche jamais prise avant, où il y avait très peu de contrôle préalable au paiement, que le gouvernement se fiait sur les représentations des contribuables, que ce soit des individus ou des entreprises. Et maintenant, il faut avoir une approche hors ordinaire aussi sur le suivi. Pour démontrer exactement ça, une bonne gestion des fonds publics. Mais encore, si le gouvernement veut prendre une approche qui est différente, une approche qui renonce à recouvrer des paiements, c'est leur choix, mais je leur encourage d'être très clairs avec les Canadiens.
Ryan?
I'm just wondering as well, the government has made additional vaccine purchases probably since your audit, the bivalent boosters and things like that. Were you able to look at those contracts on a go-forward basis to know if the government is putting better controls in place so there won't be more wastage going forward? Because we know there hasn't been a big take-up, for example, in bivalent boosters compared to Canada's population.
So unfortunately, I can't talk about the terms of the contracts that we did look at. They're all within the 7 that we examined. I think the way to control wastage and to better monitor take-up would be to really implement all the functionalities of Vaccine Connect. The goal was to ensure that every Canadian who wanted to be vaccinated could have access to vaccines, and that was achieved. Now it's about minimizing wastage and better inventory management going forward.
And you may not be able to answer this one, but you talked about, you've seen the terms and conditions. Most Canadians have not seen the terms and conditions. Are you satisfied that we paid reasonable prices for the vaccines? Were we paying prices that were equal or equivalent to what other Western countries paid?
So it's a difficult question again to answer. If you go back to what the market looked like back in 2020 when the negotiations had to take place, as I mentioned earlier, no one knew which vaccine companies would be successful. No one knew which vaccines would be ultimately approved for use in Canada. Canada did not have manufacturing capabilities for these vaccines, so all of those factors played into the prices that were negotiated. When it comes to comparing to other countries, again, very difficult. Most of those countries, one, have not made those prices publicly available, but likely had manufacturing capabilities, and so you would expect that they would pay a different amount than a country that did not have access to vaccines so readily.
Chris from National Post on the line from a very last question, and then JP Tasker from CBC, and that will be it.
Ms. Hogan, I just wanted to circle back to the tables towards the end of your report. So you talked about obviously the $27 billion that you said CRA needed to investigate even more, but then in the tables at the end, you seem to have supplemental amounts on top of that you say should also be investigated, but are even excluded, from what I understand, from the $27 billion. And that includes like $1.2 million in CERB payments to dead people, or the $6.1 million to people who were incarcerated when they received it. What's the distinction there? Why aren't those amounts in the should be investigated? Like, not suspicious enough? What is it exactly?
Well, that's exactly why the statement that I made was that we've identified at least $27.4 billion in payments to individuals and businesses that require further investigation. There are other elements, as you say, in the back where we talk about each individual program. There we were just missing too much information to either have an audit level confidence that we should put them in the $27.4 billion, or we couldn't really quantify them in a good way. So again, it's about missing information, and that's why post-payment verification is really the only way to confirm the actual amounts paid to ineligible individuals, and that's why we recommended much more rigorous work is needed.
JP from CBC.
Yeah, I had a very similar question to Chris there. I want you to kind of talk about that 27.4 billion figure. It seems like it's a minimum, right? And then there are other sections that you just couldn't. There's other potential cases of overpayments that you didn't include in that figure. Can you just kind of speak to why those weren't included, and maybe how much they could be worth?
Again, it was really the uncertainty around some of the amounts and the missing information. So, for example, an individual who died during the year would have been eligible for payments up until their date of death. And so there is some information that we didn't have during our audit in order to make good conclusions, right? So that's why we triage them into different buckets. Those that we have a lot more confidence are included in the $27.4 billion. And then there is further follow-up needed for other amounts, both on the individual and business front.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, merci à tous. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Thanks to all for your great discipline. We've been through a great amount of questions, so that is how it should be. Merci à Madame la vérificatrice générale et sur ce, bonne journée.
Merci, bonne journée. Thank you.